for being here again. We are going to transition. Our next talk is Dr. Audrey Chen Liu from University of California, Irvine. And Audrey, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and letting me talk a little bit about a project that was actually started as a BioTAP scholar. When we think about how we want to train our TAs, I think one thing that oftentimes is overlooked is thinking about how we actually train people to provide written instructor feedback on biology lab reports. So when we talk about the rubric we're developing here, what we're really doing is grading the grader. I think sometimes when I talk about my work, it's a little bit confusing because it's kind of this I don't know if it's like meta look on things, but I think one of the things that I hope to persuade you in this introduction is that we all care about student-centered teaching, right? This is where knowledge is constructed by the students rather than just being like a one-way transmission from the teacher to the students. And when you have student-centered teaching, that's when you have like active student participation, and the instructor really becomes less of an authority figure of like you must learn the correct answers, so more of someone who's a facilitator or partner in the learning. And they're really trying to personalize the learning outcomes and allowing students to learn from their mistakes. And I think one of the ways that we want to do this is through the actual student-teacher interactions, where in the traditional sense, it was like in the classroom, but I think what we oftentimes don't think about is that it's not just about the classroom interactions, but also about those written communications. And I think also when we think about like our traditional synchronous in-person settings versus the asynchronous settings, we're realizing that, it was possible to teach asynchronously. It was possible to teach in ways that we didn't think were possible, like 5 years ago. But as it becomes more and more popular to have asynchronous settings for our teaching, I think those written communications really are going to take even more of a forefront than they have been in the past. And so, what are those challenges for feedback? And I don't think you need literature to know this. You've probably already experienced this yourself as instructors and people who have trained TAs as also. And oftentimes learners complain they don't get enough feedback, or sometimes they complain they get too much feedback and can't make sense of it. On the educator side, educators often resent the amount of time that's actually invested into providing that feedback. It takes a bulk of time, and it appears that feedback actually appears to be ignored. And so you can see both parties describe this emotional component, and maybe you can even say like it's usually associated with negative emotions. Oftentimes the feedback is evaluative without actually providing learners strategies for improvement. And I think part of this could be that educators rarely receive formal training on how to provide effective feedback. So this is something where we know that student-centered learning is really important, and we're realizing that written instructor feedback is going to be maybe a key component, or if not a key component, at least it's going to be something that's going to be more important in the new ways that we're teaching. So one of the frameworks that we use to develop the rubric is coming from a group in Monash University in Australia. It's actually a collaboration from a couple of different universities in Australia. And to start off, they define feedback as a process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. And so a couple things to highlight here is that it is a process. It's not just comments that are given one time, but it's a process, and the focus is on learners. And also a little bit more is that we really want to see them make sense of the information provided to actually be able to be self-regulated learners as well. So that's part of the definition of feedback. Okay, so they've also defined in their framework 12 conditions that enable effective feedback. And I'm not going to highlight all of these for you. I'll just highlight a couple of them. One of them is that these learners are active in the feedback process. Another one I wanted to highlight is that the information provided is usable and learners know how to use it. And also that they are tailored to meet the different needs of the learners. So when you look at the literature, there is a plethora of literature actually coming primarily from literacy and K through 12 education, but very little of it actually is coming from the literature from discipline-based biology education research. And so the question is, even though there are these frameworks, including the one that's on this screen, how do they actually apply into the biology setting? How do we actually use it so that we provide better feedback on biology lab reports? So our two research questions were, what criteria should be included in a rubric used to evaluate instructor feedback on biology lab reports? And also what constitutes naive, novice, apprentice, and master instructor feedback on a biology lab report? So the way that we did this is that we wanted to first establish content validity. I approached this project kind of thinking of it as we're developing instruments. It's not quite an instrument in that it's not like items that you need to have item analyses where there's a questionnaire, but it's an instrument in that this is a rubric that we want to make sure that it actually does comprehensively represent all the facets of instructor written feedback on a lab report. So to do that, there were two stages of this process. The first part of this was to review the literature on feedback effectiveness, scientific writing, and biology competencies. And that was the initial basis for the rubric. And I should mention also Elise Bowie was actually a key player in developing that initial basis. So she was one of my research assistants at the time. She's now gone on to become a K through 12 teacher. Okay, so the second stage of this was then to interview faculty experts. And we selected these experts based on their extensive experience in either teaching, scientific writing, and or a demonstrated publication record of scholarship in feedback evaluation or teaching professional development. And definitely want to thank all the people who were involved in this study. Okay, so after our interviews, these were think out loud interviews and they were triangulated with semi-structured interviews. We then transcribed the interviews and then used the inductive coding scheme. And that inductive coding scheme did have a nested coding scheme to it. So we had subcodes within our codes. And then we use that information to then revise it. And we're now at the stage where we're trying to establish face validity and also usability. And we're doing that simultaneously in this next phase, interviewing graduate students. And we're asking them to think out loud as they try to use the rubric to evaluate sample instructor feedback. So what were the different criteria that our literature and our experts identified? And they were themed together into three different categories: feedback content, feedback culture, and feedback usability. And I'm not going to show you, obviously not going to show you the whole rubric, but I wanted to go over a little bit about what does this mean. So formative feedback is basically feedback that monitors the student's ongoing learning progress by noting where the student's current performance stands relative to learning objectives. So the instructors should be monitoring where they are, as well as also where they would like to be considering the learning objectives. The next one is depth. So this is that quality feedback is going to be feedback that actually places emphasis on the scientific discourse and structure rather than just surface level features like the grammar or the spelling. And the feedback's also going to address some essential biology skills there. The next one is that in the content of the feedback, we do want to include praise So I know many of you might have heard like the sandwich method. We're not talking about the sandwich method. Instead, it's that this positive feedback is actually credible and it's backed up with specific points. Students do recognize when they're just sandwiches and they don't actually have any like substance to the positive feedback. So good quality praise is going to be credible because it points to specific examples or particular sections stand out as being better than the rest of the assignment. It will also include constructive criticism. So the instructor gives both directive feedback, meaning they're pointing out particular sections of the assignment that need improvement, as well as areas where they're giving facilitative feedback, which is basically providing students with enough information to independently reevaluate their work and learn from their previous mistakes. So we're building the skills for them to be able to not just follow instructions, but actually be able to think about what are the skills that the instructor is trying to build into them. For feedback culture, one point that is really important is a two-way dialogue. So it's not just that this is a one-time point when an instructor is giving feedback, but that even though we're looking at the feedback on one particular assignment, there's evidence of a two-way dialogue that's been ongoing. So there's comments and questions and seem to invite the students to converse further. So the conversations continuing into the future, and also that it's been ongoing in the past because it references prior things that the student and the instructor may have talked about. Another criterion is goal orientation, and this is that the feedback motivates the students to revise their lab report. So it's explicitly trying to encourage students to become self-regulated learners who are proactive rather than simply reactive to their feedback. The other thing is in terms of developing a culture of building trust between the instructor as well as student, the rapport and tone is going to be important. So this is feedback language that develops this communication rapport between the student and the instructor. So the word choice shows that it's non-threatening, and it's trying to break down the communication barriers that may have stemmed from maybe instructor-student authority gap. And then we want that feedback to be usable. So when we think about usability, the first thing is clarity. And clarity is that it's not just concise. I think sometimes we think that it just means concise. And I think it's the marks are actually going to be more complex than a few word summaries, but it's going to be to the point. It's also going to be given in manageable units. So there's going to be scaffolding where the instructor isn't just going to be telling everything about something, but taking what the student knows and building up into manageable units of what the students can actually understand. So that's going to help to make sure it's easily understood and integrated into subsequent drafts by the student. Another criterion is timeliness. So the feedback issued should be soon after the submission of the draft to allow enough time for the student to make any necessary revisions before the next submission. And the last thing is this transferability, which I'm going to expand on in the next slide. So when you think about the different levels of transferability, thinking about mastery, exemplary, accomplished, developing, or naive, what do they look like? Can they be distinguishable? Because if we want to use a rubric, we want to make sure that they're not overlapping different levels of mastery. So for exemplary types of feedback, in terms of transferability, this is feedback given in a way that can be applied not only to the assignment that's being evaluated, but also future assignments across disciplines. And also it could be even into like non-academic settings such as work and personal research. When we're looking at something that still is accomplished or maybe doesn't have all the features of a master level transferability of feedback, is that that feedback is given in a way that can be applied to not only this assignment being evaluated, but also future assignments into several related topics. So the key difference here is about the scope in which it can be applied to. So can it be applied to things that are across disciplines, or is it to just related topics? For developing feedback in terms of transferability, it's that feedback cannot be applied to assignments that are too different. So it's only applicable to other lab reports with very similar research questions or specimens. And for naive, it's actually just feedback that would only be helpful to actually be improved on this particular assignment, but not actually to any other work. Okay, so that kind of gives you a view of the rubric in terms of the different criteria, and also in terms of like within one criterion that I'm showing as an example, what are ways that we can differentiate between different levels? And so I think the implication for this, for professional development as well as for education research, is that we can basically use this rubric to train TAs on characteristics of high quality feedback on a lab report. That's something that I think is overlooked currently in the way we currently teach our TAs. And also the rubric can be used to evaluate teaching artifacts for instructor feedback rather than relying on self-report or impressions from students. So I think a lot of times in our research, we're oftentimes relying on self-report or even impressions from students. But this is something where we can increase the pedagogical tools where we can actually evaluate teaching artifacts for hopefully something that's a little bit more objective. And so some potential applications are perhaps you could use this rubric to look at the variability among TAs. Are certain TAs using more praise than others? Why would it be that some TAs are using praise more than others? Maybe comparing the effectiveness of teaching interventions aimed at improving scientific writing, or maybe comparing the impact of professional development programs on grading practices. So those are the things where we might be excited about how to use this, but there are definitely limitations to the feedback rubric, and I definitely feel like through this project, I've definitely seen a lot of the limitations of what this rubric can and cannot do. And even though I tried to limit the scope of this rubric to just lab reports and biology lab reports, I realized that even within lab reports, if the laboratory exercise was just a confirmation study, it's different than when you're writing for a structured inquiry or guided inquiry or open inquiry or authentic inquiry. And depending on what type of lab report it was, it actually could differ in terms of the feedback that you want to give it. So even there, we have some limitations on this rubric. The other thing is that the way that this rubric is designed is that it's designed so that you can look at a teaching artifact. So another way to say that is to look at some instructor written feedback on an actual student lab report, and then be able to assess qualities or proficiency of the feedback that the instructor gave. But it's only applied to a single student assignment, right? So it doesn't actually evaluate the instructor as a whole, or even just capturing like how well their feedback was the same across different students. So were they consistently applying the same grading marks? This is something that this rubric doesn't do. The other thing is that the individual learning differences, such as personality, gender, culture, ethnicity, and the list goes on, all of these actually have a really important role in how the feedback is actually received. And this is not something that we can easily assess by looking at a teaching artifact. And so those are things where we're limited in how much this rubric can actually be able to tell you about how well an instructor is actually relating and developing trust with their students. So in terms of the future directions, I'm really interested in exploring those psychosocial factors and how people are receiving feedback in terms of the direct things that are still ongoing for this project, we definitely want to incorporate more external validation of the tests to see whether rubric is sensitive enough to assess a diversity of feedback and to examine the rubric reliability. And also, we want to build supplementary handbooks with examples to aid rubric use. And in terms of future work, in terms of the psychosocial parts, a student has recently joined me. We're really interested in looking at how students from individualistic and collectivist cultures respond differently to instructor feedback. And I'm going to breeze through this. I see Caleb is keeping track of time, so I should really push forward. Some of my other projects are examining how students actually are able to recall and enact feedback. And also, obviously, this is looking at high quality feedback, but we don't always have the bandwidth. So future studies will also look at efficient feedback. So what is the amount of time typically spent for different practices? And then how much can we have the most impact if we can't be giving high quality feedback on everything? And also examining the relative timing of evaluative and descriptive feedback. I'm happy to talk about that more. I know those are a lot of jargon that I kind of threw out at you, but happy to talk about that more in the Q&A if you're interested. I'll just end on just acknowledgements of people who did the work. Elise Bowie was really the one who spearheaded this project. She started it off from the very beginning and got it to the point of doing the expert interviews. And then other students that you see here, Andre, Mario, and Abraham, are taking over to look at the feasibility and usability. And then also another student, Anthony Mahin, is looking at the new psychosocial factors that affect feedback. So I also want to thank Kapad, who was the group of people, the scholars that helped me think about this work a lot better. So it was Chris Miller, Gina Sibilia, Star Sharp, and Francesca Williamson. I think they've really helped me to think about my work better. And as well as the BioTAP network, I think I really learned how to be a better education researcher through the network. And so I want to thank all the people who participate in the study. So thanks.
Awesome. Great. Really cool work, Audrey. We can squeeze in a couple questions here if anybody has some. So throw those in the chat or unmute yourself and ask.
So I just want to clarify, because I'm doing this similar work where my coworker and I wrote the scientific writing curriculum, and we are gotten the TAs to provide feedback to the students. Does your questionnaire and rubric, does that evaluate feedback that the TAs provide, or does it a rubric to evaluate the students' writing?
Yeah, so that's oftentimes something that I realized was hard to understand about my work. It's actually a rubric on the actual instructor feedback. So it's grading the grader. So I know there are a lot of rubrics already out there for scientific writing to evaluate student writing, but this is more about how do we look at how instructors write feedback onto the student writing.
And do you think your rubric or questionnaire will be applicable to like I would be interested to use your rubric in the feedback that we've given our students.
Yeah, definitely contact me. I'm happy to share. And actually, one of the things that maybe some people who've seen this project earlier have seen is that it's been really hard to recruit. So I'd be very happy to share at this point so that we can get more people to look at it and get basically more eyes to look at the face validity and usability of it. So I'm very happy to share at this point. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you again, Audrey. Great talk. And again,
can I ask a question? Sorry.
Yes, please. We can.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah, I'm a TA from chemistry department here at Binghamton University, and I was interested in this conference, so I attended. So I had a quick question. So I was wondering if you have studied the consistency of lab reports and how it can help the performance of the students. For example, here we have 5 to 6 different labs, for example, in an organic chemistry lab or general chemistry lab. None of them are kind of related. So I'm wondering how consistency between these lab report can help to the performance of the students. You know what I mean? And not separate things. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that kind of hits on the point of transferability. So I actually think it might be a strength of the program that each lab is writing about different things. We don't want to just train students on how to write better on this one particular type of assignment. And instead, are we teaching skills that transfer across different types of lab reports? So I definitely think that that's something that would be very interesting, so we could actually track how well our students actually improving as they go through these different diverse types of chemistry classes. This rubric might not actually do that in terms of assessing it, but the rubric would be able to tell you, could predict whether or not one particular assignment, sorry, I should say, predict the instructor feedback on one particular assignment has like potential to be transferable, but then you could actually in your setting test whether or not it was transferable. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I see. I mean, that's a lot of work. Yeah, I mean, we can study that for the future, how it can help. But yeah, thank you for the answer. I got my answer. Thanks.